Oh, 1672.
Yeah, sure.
All right, good to see you all again. Another week. Last week of October. Ooh, we're moving into our next month. Yes, sir. One more month to go after this. Yes. More like a month and a half, right? We have like one class in December. You want afraid of spiders? Real or unreal?
Yeah.
You are, sir?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll stay out of your general range, sir. And we're gonna dress up for Halloween on Thursday for class? Wear anything interesting? I might give someone 3 extra credit points towards his
Are you dressing us?
I might. It's a possibility. Possibility.
You don't do it.
Oh, if I did do it, it would be a surprise. Be a surprise. But if anyone wants, well, you never know. If you have a tie or something, a pumpkin tie or sweater or I don't know. Want to wear a beard or something, male or female, doesn't matter. Beard. Something mask. 3 points. Yes. Okay. Good to see you all. Again, we're talking about the Bible. Again. Where did I leave off? I think I was about to. Oh, we're going to talk about that. Be good. Talk about the Old Testament. I think I'm done with that, and I'm on with the New Testament. The New Testament. Pretty much the same thing, I guess. Jewish writings written by Jews. Canon not settled for a long period of time, just like the Old Testament, etc. and so forth. Some things were clear, though. All right. So, the New Testament. We have Jesus, the Jew. Okay? Jesus had scriptures, yes? He had the Old Testament to work from. Certainly he had the Torah, but he mentions the other writings as well. He quotes from Psalms and prophets like Isaiah and other prophets. Not sure Jeremiah, but Isaiah. Anyways, he never tells his followers to go and write things, and he never himself, as far as we know, wrote anything. As far as we can tell, if we assume, make an assumption here, he probably didn't know how to write. He was probably illiterate. If he were a carpenter, because carpenters, as we know, well, maybe we don't know, but carpenters or woodworkers is another way of translating the Greek word. Were kind of really low on the totem pole. You know, they weren't as bad as beggars, who were the lowest of the low, but they weren't as good as people, property owners, people who had a little farm or something. They were just skilled tradesmen, you know, woodworkers, okay, like laborers and stuff like that. So they were probably, he was not educated in how to read or write, but you never know. I wasn't there. But he never gives any indication that he wrote. There's no indication in Christian writings that he was a writer or told people, or he did write himself or told people to write. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have writings or couldn't have them, because voila, eventually specific writings by believers in Jesus, not Jesus himself, but specifically Christian writings start to appear several decades after the life of Jesus, his ministry. Okay, written, as I said, by probably all Jews, I would imagine, who were believers in Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ. And these writings were then added on to, as I showed you before, they were added on to the scriptures that they already had as Jews, what we call the Old Testament. So, I mean, the Old Testament, I might have said this, but I'll say it now. If I said it again, I'll just repeat it. The Old Testament, they had scriptures. They didn't necessarily need more sacred writings. They had them. They had the Old Testament, which was then reinterpreted and reread in the light of Jesus, their encountering sacred writings. From their encounter with the person of Jesus of Nazareth, it then transformed how they encountered their previously known writings from God, their inspired writings in the Old Testament. Okay, they started to mean different things to the followers of Christ than they meant to the Jews in general. Okay, so they were reading them differently. They were reading them through the prism, one might say, of Jesus of Nazareth, their encounter of what they knew about him. So encountering sacred writings. What they knew about Jesus transformed even how they had been hearing and understanding texts read in the synagogue probably their whole lives. Oh, I forgot to mention, I mentioned the Targumim here. I forgot to mention Targumim in the other. Oh, well, anyways. Where am I going with this? Oh, but they did get a New Testament. Christians, for some reason, felt motivated, Mr. McKillop, motivated, yes, inspired to start writing down what they knew and believed about Jesus. Actually, I should say, the earliest Christian writings have nothing to do with Jesus, actually. We'll get to that in a moment. The letters of Paul are really, Jesus is certainly mentioned. They're clearly Christian letters, but they're not dealing with the life and teachings of Jesus. Really, Paul's addressing problems in various churches and communities, groups of Christians that he's dealing with. And then later on, people think, it occurs to somebody, hey, maybe we should actually write down the story. Is that you, Lou? Is that you, Lou? Nesquik. Oh, Nesquik. Ooh, that's even better. Yoo-hoo for me, always had kind of like a weird aftertaste. Nesquik is good, but it's fattening. Maybe not for you, sir, but definitely. Anyways, my point was, what was my point? Oh yeah, eventually, it seems kind of, putting the cart before the horse, doesn't it, Mr. McMaster? That only later somebody had the brilliant idea, a light bulb popped above his head, like, all these stories I've been told about Jesus, and maybe I should write some of them down. Some of them, Miss Cobb. We don't even know that they wrote all of them, but we know that they didn't write all of them because we have other gospels, with more stories about Jesus that other people did not write down. So eventually specifically Christian writings start appearing and are gathered into what we call the New Testament, the New Covenant. And there are 4 sections to the New Testament as well. Okay? It's the New Testament. First, we have the Gospels, these books called Gospels. Then we have one book, which is a history. It's a history. Mr. Jastrzębski, yes. Then we have a bunch of letters, and then finally we have one book which is an apocalypse, and it's apocalyptic literature. It's like we have wisdom literature. It's a whole genre of literature called apocalyptic, with visions of heaven and the end of the world and stuff like that. And we find that's in the Bible. There's Jewish apocalyptic, there's pagan apocalyptic. It's a genre. There's nothing specifically Christian about it, but we do have one apocalypse, the Apocalypse of John, the Book of Revelation, as it's also called. So these are the 4 divisions of the New Testament. This is where we put the different writings. So we'll start with the Gospels, because the Gospels are about Jesus directly and are the most important. They are the heart of the New Testament, really the heart of the whole Bible, even of the Old Testament as well. But certainly the Gospels are the main focus of the New Testament. And there is only one gospel. The word gospel don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it now. Ms. Hela comes from two Greek words, eu, the prefix eu, which means good, which we know from euphoria, yeah, good feelings, as opposed to everyone's favorite friend in the last 5 years and 10 years, dysphoria, bad feeling. Eugenics, good genes. You try to manipulate genes so that people have good genes and not destructive genes. Euphony, good sounds. Euphoneo, to make sound or noise. So good. Angelos, angel, means message. Message. News means macrame. News, as it's often translated. Good news. Good news. Really, literally, it should be the good message, but okay, whatever. Gospel. Evangelion, the good message. So it's a message, Miss Cobb, not a writing. Something told to people. Hey, Miss Cobb, got some good news. And I take out a piece of paper and I hand it to you. Okay, maybe, all right, you wrote the good news on here. But usually, if someone's like, hey, I've got some good news. Oh, tell me, You're expecting oral presentation. Not expecting me to give you a book, right? Tell me something. Yeah, the message about Jesus. That's the good news. It's a good message. However, the word gospel transforms its meaning into an actual genre. The gospel. The container of the good news. The message. So it then comes to mean a type of literature containing the message of Jesus' ministry, his teaching, interpreting who Jesus is for us, proclaim. What, score big or something? Three cherries? I don't know. Beer. Is anyone listening to me? Yeah, other than my guardian Amy. All right, Miss Snyder, I got it. Kelsey, okay, that's you. Good. Yeah. There's not headphones. I don't know why I'm asking. That's all. Then you don't have to take them off. Anyway. So, do you understand what I'm saying? This idea, concept of the message becomes an actual thing. It becomes concretized as the gospel. So, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, yes? If you read the Gospel of Mark, which you do not have to do for this class, but that's how it's opening verse of the Gospel of Mark, for example. Beginning of the gospel, okay? And he seems to be using the word gospel in the sense of his book, what he's writing. This is the start of my gospel about Jesus. However, when you read his gospel and the word is used, it seems to mean a message. As the so you have that original meaning still contained in the story. Okay, but you can see kind of the change and the shift come about even in Mark's gospel when he uses the term. Okay, I'm going to say my page. Here we go. What am I doing here? Well, that's a question, Ms. Mackerley. We should get like Dr. Messina in class, Dr. Cluis, like, what am I doing here, Dr. Messina? Well, that's a good question. Hegel would say, Immanuel Kant, anyways, we have 4 gospels that have come down to us that are accepted by the church. I shouldn't say 4 because I don't want you to think there are only 4. There are other gospels, things that call themselves gospels, but only 4 are accepted into the canon of the New Testament as authentic portrayals of the church's memory, encounter with Jesus. These truly and authentically give you an encounter with Jesus as he really was. And so we have 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 holy gospels. in that order. Not always in that order. In some manuscripts, early manuscripts, it's Matthew, John, Mark, and Luke. So the order doesn't seem to really matter in which order they come in. And it doesn't tell us who was first and who was last, because Matthew, as you can see from the dates already that I give you here, Matthew was probably written in the 80s AD. Mark was in 65. So even though Mark comes second, Mark is clearly earlier than Matthew. John is last, and John is the latest, apparently. But, the gospel, these books, this genre of literature called the gospel starts appearing between the time of 60 to 100 AD. Before that, they're just seem to be just telling stories about Jesus. But nothing, we don't know if anything was written down. At least we haven't found anything. And of course, my stinking Mark. Oh yeah, it's gonna, of course, it's gonna go all the way to the end, isn't it? Or did it fall off? Oh, man. Where's my phone? Oh. My pocket. It gets worse when I walk around with my eyeglasses on my face and I'm saying, where are my eyeglasses? All right. What am I talking about here? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, Matthew is first in the order, but not written first. Mark is in red and all caps with asterisks to indicate to you, make you notice that it is important. Why is it important? Because scholars believe it was the first gospel that has come down to us in written form. Okay, maybe there were other written gospels before it, we just haven't found any, but Mark seems to be the first, probably written in the mid-60s. Then we have the Gospel of Luke, written around the time of Matthew in the 80s, and then the latest John in the 90s to 100s. These are the common dates, okay, with some variations, all right, but these are the generally accepted dates. You'll find, some variations in other books, so just don't go crazy on me, if you see something on the internet or something. Dr. Dunn, they say 70 to 75 for Mark. These are the generally accepted dates. Other people might have other dates which place the Gospels later or earlier. Like some people might place John earlier, which I would have no problem with. I mean, the reasons for placing John so late are really more people's idea of his view of Jesus. They think that it's too developed an idea because he thinks Jesus is God. Well, Jesus is still God in Mark's gospel too. At least Mark portrays him not as clearly as John does, but it's clear that Jesus is not just a human being. So, I mean, you have to kind of it's guesswork. It's supposition, supposing. Do you suppose that already in the 60s, you would have someone writing a gospel where Jesus is a divine figure? Yeah, I can suppose it. I could suppose a lot of things. If we're just supposing, but where's your proof? Where's your proof? But anyways, I'm not giving you my opinion here. I'm giving you the general scholarly consensus. But if John were written in the 60s like Mark, I don't care. I'm not losing any sleep. That's fine. So probably in the 90s, I guess. And who are these people? We don't know. I mean, I know that's probably not consoling to some of you, maybe a lot of you, but we don't know who they are. We just have the names. It's the gospel according to Matthew, whoever Matthew was. But, we know there was a Matthew amongst the 12 apostles of Jesus. Is it the same Matthew? I don't know. I wasn't there. None of us was. Okay? And it never indicates that it's Matthew the apostle. And it is Matthew the apostle. At least the earliest manuscripts. It just says, Kata Mathion, according to Matthew. They left out gospel. That was understood. According to Matthew. Okay. And then, there's Christian tradition and historical traditions that it is connected to the actual apostle Matthew. Okay, fine. Again, I'm not going to
I get up to the pearly gates and I find out, St. Matthew comes out to me. He's like, nah, I didn't write a word of it, Matty. I mean, I'm glad I'm your namesake, but not my words. Not me. Maybe another Matthew, but not me. I say, okay, St. Matthew. Listen, Levi. And he's checked that. I'll say, okay, Miss Paul. I'll be like, all right, Matthew. I would have wanted it to be written by you, but it wasn't. That's okay. That's not my main concern. My only question, St. Matthew, whoops, sorry. What's my main question, Miss Casada? Where is the Indian buffet? Where is it? That's all I care. That's all I'm going to worry about. And of course, we'll go there and find Jesus like hoarding all the lodgings because he's the Son of God and he can do that. So he's having. All right, Jesus. All right. You call me a glutton and a drunkard. Yeah, Jesus, give me some of the lodgings. Anyways. So Matthew, okay, it's a name, and we have a historical tradition that says it was one of the 12 apostles. So, apparently an eyewitness. Okay, that's fine. Maybe. There are some problems with that view, though, which I'll mention. Then we get to Mark, the earliest of the Gospels. Now, Markos is not an uncommon name. Who's that? Okay, not one of the 12 apostles. There's no Mark amongst the 12 apostles. No Mark mentioned in the Gospels at all, the stories of Jesus at all. There is a Mark mentioned in other parts of the New Testament as a disciple of this man Paul. Paul is a major figure. Okay. And then later historical tradition says that this Mark, the gospel writer, was a disciple of St. Peter the Apostle, Simon Peter, who was one of 12. And that, they were living in Rome at the time, the city of Rome. And that Mark would listen to Peter preach and talk about Jesus. And then somewhere along the line, Mark got the brilliant idea that I should write some of this down. Maybe I should write some of this down. Yeah. Which he apparently did. And whatever he wrote down, kind of formed the nucleus of what came to be his gospel. Maybe. Okay. That's the story. Again, I don't know. The gospel does not identify specifically who it is, what Mark it is. Nor with Luke, nor with John. Luke, which is Lukos in Greek, or Luca, I think, is actually a shortened form of Lucian, Lucianos, Lucian. Who's that? I mean, again, it's not an unusual name. I don't know how common it was in the ancient world, but it's beautiful. There's no Luke amongst the apostles of Jesus, no Luke in the Gospels. Again, there is a Luke who's a follower of Paul, the apostle, this man Paul, who journeys around with Paul, proclaiming the gospel. Is that where he got his message from? Paul? Maybe. He's connected with this guy Paul. And that's where he got it from. Maybe. That's, what some early Christians thought. Must be that Luke. It must be that Luke. That Miss Ptolemy, that's a danger. That's a red flag, Miss Ptolemy. Wait. Give this to her. Sorry, I was trying to get it on your bag, Miss Ptolemy. Spider coming for you, Miss Ptolemy. No, that is a red flag. I mean, it's not a great argument that, it must be. Well, why must it be? What makes it has to be Luke, the Luke who followed Paul? Because there are other people named Luke. Maybe other Christians named Luke. I don't know. So we don't know where Luke got his story from. He does. He does tell us at the beginning of his gospel that who his sources were. He never names Paul. He names other eyewitnesses and other ministers of the word, people, preachers, but he never mentions Paul as one of his sources. I don't know why there was that connection. But then again, maybe he just decided he just didn't. It's possible. Again. But even so, Paul was not a follower of Jesus. This man Paul, famous early Christian, but he didn't follow Jesus. He didn't even know Jesus personally. He didn't live in Palestine. He's from a faraway city. He didn't know Jesus from Adam. Because Jesus is the second Adam, you see. I know. That's it. So again, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, and even if he got his information from this man Paul, Paul wasn't an eyewitness. So it's third hand for Luke, if it is accurate that this is the same Luke. And then we have John. John, yes. Which John? A lot of Johns in Judaism, not an uncommon name. John the Baptist, John the son of Zebedee, one of the apostles. John Mark. Mark had two names. His Jewish name, John Yochanan, and there's also Marcos, which is a Latin name, actually. I don't think it's Greek at all. It's from Latin. So he had a Gentile name as well, which a lot of Jews did. They had two names. They went by two names: their Jewish name and then their pagan or Gentile name. So Mark was also known as John. Did Mark write two different types of gospel? Don't know. But we do have a John who was an apostle of Jesus. Usually Christian tradition has assigned this gospel to him. Don't know. There's no there's no way to identify who wrote it. Okay? None of the gospels identifies the actual author. So we're basing this on historical tradition, which could be correct. I'm not saying it's not, but also it could be based on just assumptions of who people wanted them to be by. Some of these, I think, are probably very correct, like Mark and Luke. Because if you're trying to lie, if you're trying to kind of give credence to your story, by saying, so-and-so, he was an apostle, wrote this gospel, therefore you should read it and accept it, right? You would choose really authoritative figures, right? I would think. I'm supposing as well. So why would you have two gospels apparently by two apostles and then two gospels by two nobodies apparently? If Mark got his information from Peter, why is it not kata petron, the gospel according to Peter? If Luke got his stuff from Paul, why not according to Paul? They would be the more important figures than two people that are somewhat mentioned in the New Testament, but other than that, they're not major figures in early Christianity. Certainly not like Peter or Paul, Peter and Paul. So it has the smell, I guess you could say, the whiff of authenticity. I'm willing to believe it and not discount it just because it doesn't make sense to me that you would assign the gospel to somebody, that no one really knew who they were. Matthew and John, people will be like, oh yeah, that's probably Matthew. That's clear. Mark? Who's Mark? Where's Mark anywhere in the story of Jesus? Yeah. Nevertheless, I come back to my first statement. Ultimately, we really don't know. We just have the manuscripts with these names on them. And they don't even say they're by the people. It's not the gospel of Mark. It's the gospel according to Mark. You might say, well, isn't just the same thing? No. Because it implies kind of like a distance, almost like he's not the source of it. It's his presentation of the gospel. It's according to him, but it's not a gospel of him. It's not his creation in a way. He's just passing on this image of Jesus
this encounter with Jesus in his word. All right, anyway. So the four gospels. Anything else I want to say about it? This picture here is a papyrus fragment. Papyrus is ancient paper, and it's very, very old. So if you're looking for stuff like manuscripts, you're an archaeologist or something, you find papyrus, then that's really interesting, and you're happy because papyrus is really old. Okay, it usually doesn't survive the elements. Okay, it's very fragile. So if you do find it, that's usually quite a find. And this is papyrus number 52. Number 52, just this fragment, just this small fragment with Greek letters. And scholars, who can read this stuff and know things, were able to figure out what these words were saying. And they're words from one of the Gospels. The Gospel of John. Gospel of John. What makes this important for Christian history is that it's the earliest physical evidence we have for any of the Gospels in existence. It dates from 125 AD. 125 AD. And it's one of those funny things, like, Matthew comes first, but Matthew wasn't written first. John comes last, but John is like the earliest evidence we have for the Gospels, even though it was probably written the latest of all of them. But maybe that makes sense if it was written the latest, whereas the earlier Gospels were so old that maybe there's stuff, whatchamacallit, not depleted, it's rotted away, or the paper do. Whatever. Doesn't matter. You know what I mean, I think. Nevertheless, it's our earliest evidence for the Gospels. 125, the Gospel of John. All right, Dei Verbum number 18. Would anyone like to read this little snippet from Dei Verbum? It's Dia Versa. Exactly. Excellent. The Gospels are the heart of all the scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, because they directly relate to the teachings, the ministry of Jesus, but especially over all those things, they relate to the account of his death on the cross and his rising from the dead. That's really the main point of all the Gospels. All the Gospels are focused on those two things, that Jesus was crucified and died, but that he rose again from the dead. Mark's Gospel, it was this guy, Otto Michel. He has a German first name, but I think he's a French scholar. But anyways, famously said that Mark was simply a passion narrative, a story of the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus with a long introduction. Everything in Mark's Gospel is really leading up to that story of Jesus's arrest, trial, crucifixion, hanging on the cross, but then his rising from the dead. The Gospel of John is even more transparent. From chapter 13, John has 21 chapters, and from chapter 13 on, it's all about the suffering of Christ, his arrest, crucifixion, and the resurrection. So the first 12 chapters, so over half the Gospel, is devoted just to that story alone. Okay? So that's the focus. Now, don't worry a lot. I'm not going to get into the whole synoptic problem, synoptic, blah, 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 blah. Basically, I just wanted to talk to you about the relationship between these Gospels, what scholars think, very quickly. Okay, just give you a bare bones thing. There are 4 Gospels, and there seems to be a relationship between 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark, scholars believe, was the earliest written. And it seems, and one of the reasons that it seems that Mark was written earlier is because all of Mark, almost all of the Gospel of Mark, appears in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. So it seems like they're copying the Gospel of Mark. and then adding on extra stuff, their own stories about Jesus that they have. Okay, but almost the whole of Mark is contained in each of these two gospels, but in different forms. They don't copy it slavishly, so scholars have to say that, they're probably copying independently of each other. So, they're each using whatever copy of Mark's gospel they have. Matthew has his own copy, Luke has his own, and they're copying it, and they're making their own changes and additions and stuff like that, their own editing to it, whatever. But it seems very clear. Just the same stories appear from Mark's gospel, sometimes in the same ordering, like one story A, then B, then C, then D, and it appears exactly the same, or maybe with a little bit of a variation in the other gospels. So, they keep the stories together. The wording is sometimes the same. Scholars sometimes make too much of the wording and as to show copying. It's too different for me. If you saw it, really compared the Gospels in Greek and saw how much Matthew and Luke do not follow Mark's text. Some places it's very clear. It's like word for word. But even within the same stories, there's a lot of divergences. So whether they were actually using, the written Mark or traditions from Mark, I don't know. I don't think it's the strongest argument for saying that they used Mark just because of the words, because they disagree so often with Mark. But then Matthew and Luke have a whole bunch of material of sayings of Jesus that Mark does not have. And this sayings material, or sayings gospel, or sayings source, whatever you want to call it, is called Q. Friend, Q. Which we have no idea what it means. Usually you'll hear that Q is an abbreviation for the German word Quelle, which means source. Quelle. Whoops. Two L's. Q. We don't know. It's been lost to history. Maybe, Redensquelle. What other word? There are combinations of Reden means to chat or to talk. So, to Rainer. What's the other one? I don't know my German. Anyways, but Quelle. And sleep better. Q. Whatever Q means, ultimately, if it does come from this German word. And it's basically all the material that Matthew and Luke share in common, in addition to what they have from Mark. And most of it is sayings of Jesus. If you isolate all this material that's called Q, that Matthew and Luke share, but is not in Mark at all, it's mostly sayings. Jesus said this, Jesus said that. There are some stories, but it seems to be mostly a collection of sayings of Jesus. And a lot of scholars think it was an actual written collection that they were copying from. Again, okay. The problem is that Matthew and Luke don't not always agree on the sayings. They have them in different forms. So, if they're copying from a written document, are they copying from different versions of it or whatever? I don't know. It's a hypothesis. Most of this is hypothesis, is guesswork, okay? We found no actual physical evidence of any of these things. This is just from what's called literary criticism. You have the documents, you can see there's a relationship. There's clearly a relationship, because if you read Mark and then go and read Matthew and Luke and John, okay, John seems to have nothing to do with Mark, doesn't even tell any of the same stories at all. But Matthew and Luke do. There's a lot of overlap. But then Matthew and Luke have a ton of material they share that Mark doesn't have. So there's overlap there. So there seems to be then a relationship somewhere along the line between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Were they copying one from the other? Were they copying something else? Again, I wasn't there, Mr. Lebedinsky. I don't lose any sleep over it necessarily. I have my own opinions and views, but whatever. I'm just giving you what most scholars think. They think there were two independent sources. One was Mark, one was Q. Matthew and Luke didn't know each other, so they were copying independently, and that's how we explain why their copies of Mark and Q are so different. And then we have John, who is independent of all the others. John apparently has no knowledge of Mark, shares almost no stories in common. Only I think it's the feeding of the 4,000 or the 5,000, where Jesus multiplies the bread and the fish. That John had. I think that's the only story that all four Gospels share. Of course, John has the story of Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection, but he tells it in a different way. So he's not deriving it from Mark or any other source. He has his own source for that information. So he seems to be completely independent from these other sources. And then, just to throw a couple other monkeys into the wrench, you have stuff in Matthew and Luke's gospel which nobody else has. Okay? The most famous examples being the infancy narrative, the stories about Christmas time, stories about the birth of Jesus. Okay? Story about the Virgin Mary, and the angel, Gabriel coming to Mary and hey, you want to have God's child? And Mary's like, right? Cool. See you later. Anyways, well, that's in Luke's gospel. That's the story of Luke. But Matthew doesn't have that story. He has a completely different story where Mary's just pregnant. She just is already pregnant with child of the Holy Spirit. Okay? There's no angel sent, no conversation as in Luke's gospel. She's just already pregnant. And then, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and these three wise men, magi, magicians, astrologers, however you want to consider them, show up looking for the new king of the Jews, who of course is Jesus. All right, that's in Matthew's gospel. And the star of Bethlehem is from Matthew. Luke knows nothing about a star appearing in the sky and moving around, leading the maybe three, who knows, magi to Bethlehem. Okay? So they're completely different stories. They're both about the infancy, the conception, and the birth of Jesus, and his early life as a baby, but they're totally different. So they're not relying on each other. We don't know where they got these stories from, Luke or Matthew. And they have other stories in addition that only they have in their Gospels. And so the stories that are peculiar to Matthew are called M, and the ones that are peculiar to Luke are called L. So this is what we get. These are and Christians have noticed this. It's not a modern thing. Christians have noticed this from the beginning. They were reading these things. They knew that Mark and Matthew and Luke told very similar stories. They knew that Matthew and Luke added stuff on that materials about Jesus they both seemed to know, but Mark didn't. Everyone seemed to admit that John was very, very different, a different kind of gospel. And they tried to make explanations of why these things were so, according to their knowledge at the time. All right. This is what we think now in 2025. Maybe it's a more accurate view. It's more correct on the creation of these things. But, whatever. Again, I get up to the pearly gates and I find out this is all right or all wrong. I'm not going to lose my mind, Miss Snyder. Not going to go nuts. Not going to go bananas. You won't see me running through heaven, this cop going... Still for me, the inspired writings. Uh-oh, sorry. Oh no, he wasn't closing the doors, just someone coming in and out. They still provide an encounter with Jesus, no matter how they were written down. But this is one of let me just say this before I move on to Acts. This is one of the planks in the argument that, probably, Matthew and Matthew was not written by Matthew the apostle, who's named amongst the apostles, because if Matthew were an apostle and he were with Jesus, part of Jesus' 12 closest followers, why would he rely on Mark to write his gospel? Why wouldn't he just write it from his own memory? Why would he rely on someone who was not one of the apostles, maybe wasn't even present himself, to write his own? Why? It doesn't make a lot of sense if he were an apostle. Again, it's supposing, and I don't think a lot of arguments from supposing, because it's like, do you suppose that Matthew the apostle would use like Mark Scott? Yeah, I do. I can suppose that. People cut and paste all the time. People are busy. People recognize that someone's going to work for them already. They're like, okay, I just take it over and add all my stuff. Add what I know. But if someone's already written the story for me and done a good job on it, I don't have to recreate the wheel, even though, I was there, maybe. Okay. I can suppose that, Mr. McKillop. I'm not saying that's what happened. But that's the problem with supposing arguments. You can suppose it. I can suppose it. Which one of us is right? Neither of us was there. Yes, but I have a PhD. I've been teaching the Gospels for like 30 years at a university. All right, fine. Okay. I guess that means something, Mr. McKillop. I guess that means something. Unless someone with another PhD who's been teaching for 30-some years at another university wants to challenge this person. All right. Could be true, could be right. Acts of the Apostles, a history, an ancient history, okay? It has, so you don't want to approach it like a history we would read today in your history books, like in high school or here in college, okay? An ancient, it's history with a point of view, okay? It has historical facts in it, but the person who wrote Acts, I already told you, Luke, but the person who wrote Acts of the Apostles is crafting the facts according to a certain point of view that he wants to get across. He has a message in his history. So it's not objective history. He's not trying to be objective, person who wrote this. Who is Luke? Our gospel writer, Luke, okay? The Gospel of Luke, according to Luke, is part 1 of his gospel, and really, Acts of the Apostles is part 2, so the two should really be together. It's called Luke Acts by scholars. They really should be placed together, but historically they're separated because Luke, they keep the gospel part with the other gospels, and Acts, which is more of a history, is separated out. Nevertheless, they're both seem to have been written by this same man, Luke, and Acts of the Apostles is really Luke's recreation of the early church. He wants to tell the story of how after Jesus, the Jesus movement surrounding Jesus moved out into the world, which for him was the Roman Empire. So if you read Acts of the Apostles, it begins in the city of Jerusalem. That's the central point, the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus died, but also where he rose from the dead. And if you read through the story of Acts, it ends in Rome, which is the capital of the Roman Empire, which people call the center of the world. They really believed that. It was like there was nothing else. And all cultures do this. I mean, in China in ancient China was known as the center of the universe. China was the center of the universe. Everything revolved around that. In the Bible, I believe the prophet Ezekiel describes Jerusalem as the midway point of the world, which is sometimes translated as navel or belly button, because that's kind of like your midpoint of your body, where your navel is, okay? So it's also a word for belly button in Hebrew. But the midpoint of the world, the middle of the world, okay, is Jerusalem for Ezekiel. So you find this in a lot of different cultures. They use this terminology, the center of the world. So Luke is telling you something about this. The message about Jesus starts in Jerusalem, which is nowhere. It's out in the boonies of the Roman Empire, but it ends up in the very center of the whole world. So in his mind, like the gospel is a success. It's reached everywhere, even though technically that was by no means true. Just in no way, shape, or form was it everywhere. Certainly not in Australia. Or the New World, North and South America, which he didn't know existed, I'm assuming. But that's his point. That's his message, okay? In Acts of the Apostles, how the early church grew. The letters, our third section. Oh, and Acts of the Apostles obviously had to have been written after the gospel, if it's part 2 of the gospel. So sometime in the 80s or the 90s, sometime, shortly after his gospel about Jesus. Then we have the group of letters. Now, this is interesting because just like Matthew comes first amongst the Gospels, Miss Senior, but is not the first of the Gospels. Follow the spider, Miss Senior. Follow the spider. Now repeat after me. I will listen to Dr. Dunn. I will do what he says. Did you do this to your coaches? Like, hey, senior, get off the computer. You got to go on the field. Subbing you in. And he's kind of like, would you give him that look that you give me? I'll bet you. All right. What was I saying? Oh, the letter. So Matthew comes first, but wasn't written. John comes last, but is the earliest evidence we have for any of the Gospels. And the letters come third, but the letters are earlier than the Gospels. They're our earliest evidence for Christian writings, not the stories of Jesus. Look at the dates, okay? From 50 AD until around 125 AD is when the letters date. So that's like, 15 years before we have the Gospel of Mark. So letters. By whom? Most of them are by this man, St. Paul the Apostle. He's called an apostle, but he is not an apostle. He's the most famous non-apostle apostle. He was not amongst the followers of Jesus. He was not amongst the 12 apostles. In fact, as I said, he didn't even live in Palestine. He was from someplace else. As far as we know, he never knew Jesus personally. But he eventually becomes a believer. He's converted, and he becomes an apostle. He has a vision of Jesus, and Jesus chooses him as an apostle in this vision. At least that's what Paul believed. That's what Paul believed. Some Christians who didn't think so, but it's another cup of coffee. Anyways. And Paul wrote a lot of letters. And we have some of these letters, which seem to be authentic for the most part. Then we have other things that, like, we have a thing called the letter to the Hebrews, which is anonymous. It's not attributed to any person. It's oftentimes attributed to Paul, okay, which it may have been, but we don't know. It's anonymous. And it's not even a letter. It's not in the form of a letter at all. It's more of a homily. It's more of a sermon that's been written down and made as a letter to, like, send out to other people, Like if you have an email or something and you copy and paste something good that you see, or you post it on X or on whatever, or you send out an email to your friends like, hey, you got to read this, or something. It seems like someone did that with this letter to the Hebrews. Hey, this is a good sermon. And I like it, so I'll kind of copy it and send it around to people as a letter. So it comes to be called a letter, even though this genre is clearly not a letter, and we don't know who wrote it. And then we've got letters by other people named Peter, James, John, Jude. Okay, these are all names of apostles of Jesus, but they're also very common names. Peter, no. Peter is almost certainly the apostle Peter, Simon Peter, one of Jesus' 12. James, we don't know. Common name. Could have been an apostle, could have been one of Jesus' relatives, could have been just anybody, a Jew who believed in Jesus, we don't know. Same with John, Jude, we just don't know. But there are letters attributed to other Christians who identify themselves. Sometimes not. So in some cases, these letters that we have, as you can see from the dates, are earlier than our earliest gospel, which is Mark. And even though the Gospels, Ms. Tran, are the heart of the New Testament, and you would think, Ms. Cobb, that Jesus should be the heart of the New Testament, right? Yet most of the New Testament is not about Jesus. It's about Paul. Paul's letters make up the bulk of the New Testament. Okay? Most of the writings in the I think 27 books in the New Testament, most of them, half or more most of the writings are from Paul, this man Paul. Like 13 letters, but then you only have 4 Gospels about Jesus. So 4 Gospels of Jesus, but you save a whole bunch of letters, double, triple the amount of letters from Paul. Where are your priorities, Christians? Anyways, but that's just, one of the, unusual things that makes learning fascinating, I think, So Paul's letters. Paul wrote letters to churches, local Christian communities, usually because there were problems. He wanted to encourage them if they were having questions and doubts. He wanted to counsel them if they were having arguments and disagreements. Usually there were problems. There are very few letters where Paul is simply writing to say, hey, good job. Philippians is one of those few. He's very happy. It's called the letter of joy because he's so joyful. He uses the word rejoice and joyful so much. I guess he was happy that he finally had something good to write about because everything was going well in the Philippian community. They were living the Christian faith. They were doing good. But the Corinthians, no, they were trouble. Galatians, trouble. Thessalonians, not so much trouble, but questions. Romans, not so much trouble, but he had to kind of convince people about him in Romans, introduce himself to the Church of Rome. Anyways, so these letters of Paul, some are considered by Paul, out of Paul's letters, this first letter to the Thessalonians is our earliest New Testament writing, written around 50. We can date it to around 50 from certain information we know from Paul's life and things that he mentions in the letter. And it ties up with other things. So around 50. So that's our earliest. So if you want to read the earliest Christian writing, read 1 Thessalonians in the New Testament. Okay? And see what Paul was saying, see what Christians were talking about. That doesn't mean that there aren't earlier traditions in the Gospels, even though they were written later. Just later does not mean that they don't contain earlier traditions that have been preserved. Okay, so just beware of that. Be aware of that. But document-wise, 1 Thessalonians is the earliest. And is considered authentic Paul, okay? Not everything that says it's by Paul, scholars believe were written by Paul. They think that some of the letters were written by people in the name of Paul. Okay, so you have authentic Paul, the letter to the Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, letter to the Galatians, the Irish people, any Irish? Holla? Irish, my peeps? Represent? No? Well, the Galatians are ancient Irish people. They're Celts, Celts, Galatas. See, the sounds almost the same. Celt and Galatas. Yeah, they're ancient Celts. I'm never going to say Celt. But anyways, ancient Celtic peoples who lived in the interior of Turkey, what's now modern-day Turkey. Okay? So the Irish are in the New Testament. Galatians, Philippians, I mentioned. 1 Thessalonians, Philemon is a man. These are all churches. Philemon is a man, a person. Ephesians, the church in Ephesus. Colossians, the second letter to the Thessalonians. And then these 3 letters, 2 to a man Timothy, which we know from 2 Timothy, we read about all scripture inspired of God. And then a man named Titus. These are over here because most scholars think these were not written by Paul, this man Paul. So to give you Paul of Tarsus. That's how he's often referred to. Paul the Apostle, Paul of Tarsus. Where's Tarsus? Well, it's in Turkey. Okay. Turkey. Here, southern Turkey, you see? It's part of southern Turkey. That's where the ancient city of Tarsus was. That's where Paul was from. Okay? And most of these letters, most of these cities to which he wrote letters, like Thessalonica, here's still Thessalonica is still there, Thessaloniki. Philippi's not. Philippi doesn't exist anymore. In Greece and Turkey, most of these letters are in Greece and mostly Western Turkey. Galatia was was a region here in the interior, which I told you about. Ephesus, Colossae were over here in the western part of Turkey. Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth, these are all in Greece, northern Greece and southern Greece. No letter to the Athenian church. I guess there weren't a lot of Christians in Athens, but anyways. But yeah, so that's what we're talking about. Those are the areas. And then Rome, of course, Rome over in Italy. All right, so that's just, something you should know for the quiz, which authentic Paul, what's not. Again, I have no problem accepting that each and every one of the letters comes from Paul in some way, because, the arguments, again, it's supposing arguments, and they're based on guesswork. Like, Paul, would Paul have written this way? Paul writes a certain way in the letter to the Romans, but then when you read, like, first letter to Timothy, Paul's style changes, stuff like that. Okay, well, I'm a writer too. I write a lot because I'm an academic, so I'm on my computer. I just finished writing a book, and I've written other things, articles and stuff. Yeah, certainly there's a way that I write, but I do change. I don't always write the same way that you could I don't know how you necessarily identify how that's like an ironclad argument that it couldn't have been by the same person. And okay, fine, if the language is so different that you're like, it just has to be somebody else writing this, because not just the words, but the way they're used is different. Okay, but usually language is the problem, that the language is so different. But the problem with that is that we know Paul used secretaries. That was a common practice. A lot of times people did not write their own letters. They had secretaries, especially if you wanted to make copies of the same letter. You needed more than one person. You could have more than one person listening to you talk and writing down. But, it was just easier to talk, get your thoughts out. You have a scribe or a secretary who writes your words down, writes down what you say, and then the secretary's job is to then kind of tighten it up, edit, take the notes of what you say, include some of the things that you actually said, but also, correct the grammar, move stuff around so the thought is more linear and not necessarily all over the place if you're just talking, okay? We know that that was done in the ancient world. Did Paul do that? Do we have evidence? Yes, we know Paul used secretaries. Because the argument, scholars will argue from the authentic letters and say, well, because we know Paul wrote Romans. The letter to the Romans comes from Paul, right? Almost 99.9, maybe not even that. I could probably say 100% almost, and really 100% effectively, of New Testament scholars would say, without a doubt, Romans is by Paul of Tarsus. And then they'll use that then to argue that, well, but Ephesians can't be, or 2 Thessalonians can't be, or Titus, because the language is so different. And some of the, Paul emphasizes certain ideas in this letter, but they're not major points in these other letters. Why is that? Well, we know this is from Paul, ergo, ipso facto 23 skidoo, Mr. Lebedinsky, these mustn't be by Paul. Someone writing in the name of Paul, saying he's Paul, but he's not Paul. What's the problem with that argument? Well, I can knock it down immediately because I've read the New Testament. Anyways, if you want to follow along with me, you can, but I'll read it to you. The letter to the Romans, which is by Paul, yes, by the Apostle Paul. chapter 16, the last chapter. Paul ends the chapter with a whole list of greetings to various people that he knows living in Rome. Paul's not from Rome, but he wants to show his connection to the Church of Rome when he arrives there. So he greets a whole bunch of people that he knows. Some of them are relatives of Paul. And other people who are with Paul also want to send their greetings. For example, does it happen here? It happens in other letters. Let me see here. I guess it doesn't happen in this letter. It happens in others. Well, what? Oh, yeah. Okay, it does happen. Anyway, so he gives a whole list of names of people, most of whom we don't know who they are. Paul apparently knows who they are. Some of them are his relatives. And then if you just looking on down, scroll down if you're on your computer or your phone, or look at if you got your Bible open, verse 21. Let's start there. Timothy. Oh, Timothy, my co-worker, greets you. So apparently Timothy is present while Paul has been composing this letter, and he wants to throw in, hey, say hi for me too. So Timothy greets you. So do Lucius and Jason and Sosipater, my relatives. Okay, they're apparently relatives, I guess, of Paul. Let's see what it says. Let's see what the next word is. Does anyone got it? Does anyone see what the next word is? What is the next word, Mr. McMaster? You don't have it? Who has it? Who has it? Help me out. You don't, not even on your phone or your computer? Oh, dear Lord. Is Mackerlane? Is Taylor? Crystal? Who have I called on today? Seraphine? How are we doing, Mr. McMaster? Verse 22. What are the next words? What? Master? What does it say? Can't find it? Who's got it? Mr. Barnett? It's 2 seconds. Romans 16:22. If I put it into Google, you got it in 2 seconds. Maybe 2-year-old man, I can figure that out. Oh. Yes. Yes. Say it, sir. Tetris. Tetris? Tetris? Spell it out, sir. Tertius? Hold on. Tertius what? Tertius what? Tertius what? Tertius. Mr. McKillop, just tell him. Go ahead. Tertius, who wrote down this letter, or more literally, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. Gaius, who is host, Gaius, right? Who is host to me, to the whole church, probably in his house. They meet in his house to worship. Greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greets you. So who's the author of the letter to the Romans? Miss Chris.
verse 22.
Is it Tertius or?
Tertius! I, Tertius, the writer of this letter. So it tells, is that Paul? I don't know, as far as I know, Paul had no other name. It's Paul, well, he did have another name, Saul. His Jewish name, Saul. But he's known as Paul. Okay? It was Paul of Tarsus, not Paul of Tertius. You know? So who is this person Tertius, who wrote the letter to the Romans? Apparently not Paul. Yes? So how can you argue from the letter to the Romans to the fact that these other letters are inauthentic when the letter to the Romans was not written by this man? How can you say Ephesians, letter to the Ephesians, definitely not by Paul? Because it doesn't sound the same like Romans or 1st or 2nd Corinthians or whatever. But I just give the example here of Romans because it's such a slam dunk. It's on these PhDs who are like, because they're assuming too. We PhDs make assumptions too that we don't think about and can't really prove. And then you point it out to them and it's like, blah, 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 blah. But it has to be by Paul. Martin Luther says it's by Paul. But it's not. So what's your judgment on these not being by Paul? There were early Christians who did question some of these letters. They weren't sure about some of them. Like the letters to Timothy. They weren't sure if they were actually by Paul. Okay, that to me is more, that makes me stand up or sit up and take notice. Okay, if even early Christians are willing to say, okay, we're not sure that these were by Paul, but not on their language. That doesn't impress me at all because people write in different ways. I know I can write in different ways, so I'm not going to assume that Paul couldn't do it. You can't argue from his authentic letters because we know some of the authentic letters that are used to justify were not written by Paul, so you got nothing. You got no argument at all. You got to find some other thing. But nevertheless, just know that this is out there. Okay, doesn't matter, not for the church. They're still in the New Testament. They're still considered the inspired word of God. Okay? But some of the letters are described as pseudepigraphs. They're false writings. Forgeries. You know, someone is using Paul's name to kind of, continue Paul's ministry, teach what Paul taught. Maybe there's a school of thought that was centered around Paul, and they're continuing. Again, it's all stuff that we don't know any of this. That's what people kind of think about it. But each of the letters say they're from Paul the Apostle, and I have no problem accepting that because, they could have been written by a secretary in the name of Paul. And finally, hold on a second. I'll finish with the apocalypse on Thursday. God bless you all. See you then. Thank you. You're welcome, sir. Have a good day, sir. Sorry. Have a good day, sir. Thanks. Your paper? I looked at my email yesterday. I didn't see anything from you with the paper. Oh, wait a second. You did. I'm pretty sure you did email. I'm sorry. I'll go back to it. Yes. I remember getting it. I'm sorry I forgot about it. Thank you for reminding me. So I'll get to it tomorrow. You're welcome. Mr. Barnett. Okay.
Come to Bertha, McKillop, McMaster, Kroll, Casada. Break. Mm. Oh, I'm gonna turn this off.